Hello everyone. I've got with me today Squee's wonderful big giant book of unspeakable horrors, created by Jhonen Vasquez and published under slave labor graphics. As I had mentioned before in my review of JTHM Director's Cut, I planned on doing a review for Squee. Squee is a spin-off series to Johnny the Homicidal Maniac that explores the life of Todd, or better known as Squee, Johnny's neighbor, who he constantly terrifies with his antics. The book contains all 4 issues of Squee, and as well as short one-off comics such as Wobbly-headed Bob, The Meanwhiles, True Tales of Human Drama, Filler Bunny, and some Happy Noodle Boy. So let's get going into the story. The plot of Squee, in comparison to JTHM, Vasquez, like at the beginning, gives a long, short blurb about how Squee was basically the second time that he tried to do a long narrative comic. The first time being JTHM, the 7 issues you find in the director's cut, and of course before that, JTHM had just been a series of strips in a magazine with no central story per se. So Squee was basically his second time making like a long narrative serial comic, and I would say that in a sense he grew as a storyteller, but in terms of like a grand plot, like there's no arcs. First of all, there's 4 issues, so the series gets done pretty quickly, and there's not a huge plot. That there's no leading up to anything. The central theme to each issue of Squee is that all the stuff that happens to Squee scares the crap out of him. Whether it's, getting abducted by aliens, or all the kids in his school being turned into zombies, or the fact that his only friend is literally the son of Satan. The overall theme of Squee in each novel, in each issue, is that it all scares the crap out of Squee. It scares him shitless, and that's the overall arc. There's not much to it, and again, 4 issues, so it's not like there's enough to lead up to a grand story. And in that long, short blurb that Vasquez gives, he even says that with Squee he just wanted to do goofy stuff. He puts it as nonsense over content, that he just wanted to do silly things with Squee and not have to worry about plot. He does introduce some interesting plot elements, but they only appear once and never happen again. One such thing that I thought was pretty interesting was this one issue where in a dream sequence Squee is able to talk to his teddy bear Shmee, and you learn from Shmee that he's literally a sponge for absorbing all the negative influence that all the scary things have on Squee. He absorbs the negative influence, preventing him from growing up into something bad. He even says, had it not been for him, had it not been for Shmee, Squee could have ended up like Johnny, in a sense. All that negativity from the things that scare him, turning him in, messing him up a lot. And I always thought that was kind of I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, if you read JTHM and kind of focused on some of the bits of interactions between Jhonen and Squee, you would almost wonder, you wouldn't have any assurance that Jhonen was having an influence on Squee, but in a way I felt like that could have been a possibility. That's where their interactions could have led to in a far future. But like I said, it only appeared, this whole like Shmi is a negativity sponge only appears one time in all of Squee, and it's never there. You never see from it again. It's just one and done. It doesn't lead up to a grander plot, because as I have said before, there is none. There is no grander plot. So, for the art of Squee, I've already been flipping through this book, so you've seen it. It's art by Vasquez. There's not much difference. It's the same art that you see in JTHM. And I would say, a little fun fact, Vasquez started writing Jhonen the Homicidal Maniac, or at least the long issues, not the comic strips. That was probably a long further back, but he started writing for JTHM in 1995 and got done with it in 1997. And from what I've been able to find in terms of information about when Squee started getting written, the first issue of Squee came out in 1997. So, like, not even a year or so after Vasquez was done with Jhonen the Homicidal Maniac, he had an issue with, he already released an issue of Squee. So I feel like with really no gap period, there was not much that Vasquez could do artistically for a new series. But again, I'm not complaining because, I love Vasquez's art. I think I've mentioned that quite a bit in the JTHM review, and I'll say it again in Squee. I really like looking at Vasquez's art because I feel like it's not something we see a lot of in other comics. One thing I will say that feels different in comparison to Squee is that it does feel a lot cleaner than Jhonen, and I even have Jhonen with me just as a comparison. I feel like why that might be is, well, I talked about how things in Jhonen just felt so cluttered, and looking back again, I feel like there's something I didn't really see before, and that is that in comparison to Squee, Vasquez had a pretty unique style of how he made the borders in his panels. I don't know if it's that visible, but if you see, the borders in the panels were a lot thicker, and they were more jagged and angular, so they really popped out in a way. The gist of it basically being that Vasquez, when he was writing JTHM, didn't use like very traditional styling for panels. They were very much his own thing, or at least as far as I know. I've never seen anyone using this style. And also they were a little bit more thicker, so I felt like you had the sort of cluttering feeling that I felt that I could see in Jhonen was probably because of not just content, but also the presentation of the content. The borders in the panels were a lot more thicker and angular, creating more of a pop if you will. But with Squee, everything's kind of the panels look a little more traditional. It looks like he's using more common means of panel borders, and that's basically all I have to say in regards to Squee. It's the same art as Johnny. I just feel like it's a little more refined, a little more cleaner, if you will. But given that there's 4 issues of Johnny, of Squee, 4 issues of Squee, given that there are just 4 issues of Squee, the rest of the wonderful big giant book of Unspeakable Horrors is filled with a bunch of other stuff. Little comics that Vasquez had written along with writing JTHM and Squee. And I'll just briefly summarize them best as I can. So, right after the 4th and last issue of Squee, we get Wobbly-headed Bob. And this tells the story of a very depressing story of an intellectual named Wobbly-headed Bob, who is grief-stricken by the fact that everywhere he goes, everyone's just a complete idiot, and there's nothing he can do to change that. And at least how I interpreted it was that that this story was in a way kind of mocking the sort of people that think they're so smart that they act like total snots to everyone else, but at the same time kind of making fun of the fact that people, at least by the masses, are pretty dumb. So that's kind of gist, I would say, of Wobbly-headed Bob. The art is pretty cool. Not really, actually. I don't know why I said that. Kind of not as good as Squee is basically what I want to say. And that's it. It's by Vasquez, but at the same time it's a little low quality, I would say. And that's just my only opinion, is it feels like less effort was put into Wobbly-headed Bob, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know the process. I just think in comparison to, say, Squee or JTHM, Wobbly-headed Bob was lower quality. After that, you get True Tales of Human Drama, and I believe this was more or less Vasquez's crack at drama stories where crazy shit happens, but for no apparent reason. And I think there's just about 3, at least in the wonderful big giant book of Unspeakable Horrors. I think there's just 3 of these, but their stories are pretty dumb fun. Like this one story, mom takes her baby to the hospital because apparently there's something wrong with the baby. The doctor starts freaking out, running out of the hospital with the baby in hand, throws the baby out of the hospital like a grenade, and the baby explodes. And, yeah, the stories are pretty weird like that. They're in the very Vasquez-y humor. And I would say they're fun. The art is a little bit better. It's a lot better than Wobbly-headed Bob, in my opinion. And that's really just all I have to say in regards to True Tales. There's then Filler Bunny and Happy Noodle Boy. Yeah, I don't really want to talk about Happy Noodle Boy. It's Happy Noodle Boy. Some of my favorite stories came out of the Meanwhiles, actually, and they take up the rest of the book. They're pretty, all the Meanwhiles are pretty much the end of the of the Squee book. And there's so many stories that I like, but I'm gonna just try and talk about some of my favorites. One of them being my favorite, Crossing Gods. It tells the story of these two kids that are school crossing guards, and they get possessed by like supernatural beings, and they duke it out. And I would say that this is my favorite story in all of the Meanwhiles, because I feel like the art is awesome. It's a lot better than True Tales or Wobbly-headed Bob for certain. It's Vasquez's art, but it's like an HD. You know, it's higher quality. Just like, for example, what kind of drew my attention was like the shape, the depth of like this girl's head. It just feels like there's fullness and dimensions to an otherwise flat, like two-dimensional black and white medium such as comics, such as at least Vasquez's comics. And it looks really nice. The quality is awesome. I kind of like the story. I feel like it's supposed to be Vasquez's like crack at anime or action adventure type stories where you have these dramatic fights and, you know, rivalries. So it's pretty funny. I like the absurdity of it, just how dramatic. As I cannot sing my praises enough. I really enjoy the art in Crossing Gods. It's the bomb, really. Somebody put shit in my pants! Yeah. The next one, actually, that I really like is the third Meanwhile, which is called High Above the Earth. Yes, I got that one right. And it's about a guy who gets abducted by aliens, and the aliens want him to mate with a chick to study how human reproduction works. Unfortunately, the chick is an actual chicken, and this being lost on the aliens, they force him to fuck the chicken. And years later, the guy is a lot older, still with the chicken, and he's telling this story to his chicken-human hybrid children. It's pretty funny, kind of clever. The art is really cool in this one. I still like Crossing Gods more out of all the Meanwhiles. It does really feel a little more sci-fi-y, just I guess with the technology around here, just the smooth edges and aliens, of course. It really kind of steps out from sort of the like dark macabre humor or dark macabre aesthetic of Vasquez, and more into just a silly parody on sci-fi. So that's High Above the Earth. That's my second favorite of the Meanwhiles. Lastly, I would say that my third favorite of the Meanwhiles is it's called In Some Testosterone Abundant Dimension. And you could tell right off the bat that this is supposed to be Vasquez's sort of kick in the nuts for how most comics are written today, where you have heroes with crazy exaggerated proportions. You've got the dude right here who's just grossly buff, and like there's even a scene where like he can't even move his arms because he's just too bulky. And like just if you can take a good look at that dude's neck, it's repulsive. Also, there's the lady, and you know, if you're someone that's ventured deep into the story, into the history of comics, you know that it's been like a very big like argument among people about the proportions of women, and clearly, I mean, if you look at most mainstream comics, this is probably like just an over exaggerated parody. Not always, but I feel like nowadays it's a little more respectful. But clearly, with the woman, just what else needs to be said? It's supposed to. She's a very incredibly thin woman with crazy huge breasts. Just like how women in comics used to be, and probably still are being drawn as. And one thing that really made me freak a little bit, at least when I read this the first time, is that when she and the dude are going up against these bank robbers, one of the bank robbers, they're like a husband-wife duo, so the wife jabs her finger into the lady's forehead, and that apparently knocks her off her center of gravity. It knocks her backwards, snapping her spine in half, and then the weight of her breasts, because they swung around, the weight of her breasts basically crushed her skull. So I first read this book along with JTHM when I was pretty young, like around middle school, you know. I was a fairly innocent boy there back then, and I just remember this like comic being, it was one of those things you can't unsee. I was very disturbed by this comic, but nowadays I just laugh at it because I kind of take this comic more or less as being Vasquez's kick in the nuts. I'll use that term again. It's his way of basically poking fun at how comics were and still are being written. And considering that this is a channel about reviewing comics, I felt like it was pretty good. It's pretty necessary to mention that. So, obviously, there's more of the meanwhiles that are awesome, but I don't want to make this video a lot longer than it has to be. So, Squee's wonderful, big, giant book of unspeakable horrors. If you like JTHM, you'll like this. If you haven't read any of those books, I would say go start with JTHM first, for a couple of reasons. It's the first of Vasquez's books as a storyteller, as a comic author. So I feel like it's kind of quintessential. Also, considering that Squee is a spin-off series, I kind of feel like you need to know sorry about that. I feel like you need to know something about the original material, but as far as I know, that's not a rule anywhere. You can get into spin-offs without knowing the original. Sometimes people do that and don't know that what they view is a spin-off. So that's fine. The other reason, and this one's actually kind of lame, you're more likely to find JTHM Director's Cut than you are with Squee. As I have mentioned before, I got these at a convention and it was per chance. But I'm sure if you really want Squee, you're gonna tear up the internet looking for it. I'm sure of it. But again, I got this at a convention, and that really shows actually, because the quality of this comic, like the pages are kind of falling out. It's not too bad, but yeah. So, that is my review of Squee. Check back soon when I have something else. Until then.